Shabbat Shalom, anybody who is joining us on YouTube. We were running a little bit late, but we are ready to go. Just wanted to welcome you and thank you for listening in. We are well into our Genesis parashas now. For those of you who don't remember or don't know what a parasha is, that is a Torah portion that was divided up by the biblical character Ezra. Basically, he came back from Babylon and he wanted the people to relearn Torah. And so he divided the Torah up into portions that could be read daily in the marketplace. And then on the Sabbath, he taught the people how to apply the things that they were listening to while they were doing their business in the marketplace. At any rate, we are in the third parasha in the book of Genesis, or what we would call Bereshit. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about the concepts that we have kind of gleaned thus far out of the parashas so far. Now, the best way for me to do that is to basically go to the board and actually kind of illustrate some of the things that we have identified and recap that real quick, because going into this portion, there's so many times that I have read this portion. I know a majority of the Hebrew in it. There's probably a few words here and there I probably don't know. And this is my second favorite portion. My first favorite portion is next week. But one of the things that's interesting is when I first began my journey in this Torah observant walk, this would have been circa 2007. My first Torah portion that I ever read was Lecha, and there was a lot of learning that went into Lecha, because it doesn't really actually say what it says in the Hebrew in the English. And so that was kind of my first experience of going, oh, wow, this isn't what it says. This is different than what it says, etc. So I think one of the first things that we need to do is go ahead and establish kind of some foundational work based upon what we've learned thus far in the Torah portions. So we'll start with that. We're going to go ahead and we will jump over to our whiteboard and basically do some illustrations really quick. Okay, so first of all, I want to remind you that we had the word or as I'm going to change this real quick here. Let's say we're going to go with that and with that and with that. Okay. Okay, so we are going to have, of course, oh, here we go. I see. So there we go. And of course, this is a really crazy looking olive and the resh, right? And actually what we have is we have the vav resh. And I'll remind you that in the Hebrew, in the English, this is represented by the word light. Okay. Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 says, let there be light. And that is the word or, pronounced or, O-H-R, or, in the Hebrew. Now, I'll remind you that when we take it back from what would be the lexical root, remember the lexical root The lexical root is 3 radicals or 3 Hebrew letters. There's a few other grammar things that go into this, but the short version is in general, if we have a yod, a hey, or a vav, an aleph, or we have we'll represent it by X's, a doubled last letter, then that is called a child root. Okay, even though it's a lexical root, this is a child root. In order to find the parent root, we have to drop one of these 3, one of these 5 things. So in this case, obviously, we're going to drop the vav, meaning that we come back to an aleph resh for our parent root. Okay, now here's the part that's important. In the ancient pictographic Hebrew, so this is the Hebrew that is on the Hebrew that's on the pottery shards that are buried in the Mesopotamian Empire, in the Sinaitic Desert, and of course in Israel. Okay, and we had we had the lead ox, and we had the head of a man. Now, I'm going to talk a minute about the lead ox, but in general, this is kind of our foundation. Now, recall that in the English, it's translated light. It says, "Let there be light." Now, let's address a few things real quick here, just kind of some housekeeping on your brain, so to speak. It says in your English Bible, "Let there be light." But it's not until verse 13 of chapter 1 that there is light that we understand. Let me explain. In our culture and understanding, we have come a long way with technology. In fact, the lighting that you see on my face right now that is like perfectly dialed in are light emitting diodes, which is just simply a resistor that heats up and emits light. If you go outside and you look at this huge orb in the sky, we perceive that and understand that to be light. In fact, we've established that light travels at about 186,000 miles per second. And so in general, we've kind of calculated how long it takes for the light to get here from the sun, about 8 minutes, etc. But that is not the light being mentioned in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3. How do we know? Because it's not until 13 that we get to the sun, if that's how we choose to understand what it's saying in verse 13. It seems that's the case, right? The greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. That's the moon, or that's the sun and the moon, and then there's the stars, and that has to do with days, years, seasons, and signs, right? Okay. So a few very, very, very important things that we need to housekeep in your head. The word light that is in the English is not the word light in Hebrew. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the word or does not mean light. It means order, okay? In the ancient pictographic Hebrew, it means order. But I will remind you of something. I'm just going to go ahead and show you this really quick. When we are dealing with this, one of the things we need to keep in mind is that these ancient pictographic roots are sometimes a little bit confusing. Let me explain to you what I mean. The word for unclean in Hebrew is tomeh. That comes from a tet and a mem. In fact, let me go ahead and illustrate that really quick on the board just to go ahead and solidify it for you. We'll open a new page. And here is the Hebrew word for unclean. Okay. Hebrew word for unclean is tet, mim, aleph. Okay. And what have we just learned? We just learned that there is a yod, a hey, a vav, an aleph, or a doubled last letter. We can what? We can eliminate that letter and find our parent root in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, which happens to be tet mem, right? Okay, which is what? A drawing of a basket, okay, and water. Okay, and so this is what? A container. Container, okay, and this is water. And so this is contains water. That right here is the actual Hebrew word for unclean. When you see the word unclean in the Hebrew, or in the English, this is the Hebrew word that's used. And so what I want you to see is that the actual container of water is the actual ancient pictographic description of being unclean. In other words, it's the solution to uncleanness. You have dirty hands, you have dirty feet. You enter the tent. Before you enter the tent, you wash your feet. There is a little pot of water at the front of the tent. Before you step onto the carpet, you sit on a seat, you sit down, you take off your sandals, you wash your feet, and you step onto the carpet and enter the tent. That is the ancient Bedouin practice that supposedly, according to them, was practiced by none other than Abraham. Okay, so as a result of that, what we have, or what you can see, is that sometimes the ancient pictographic Hebrew doesn't necessarily describe the thing in a way that we would understand it. In other words, a container of water does not make us think about something being unclean. But the truth is the only reason you have a container of water in front of the tent in the first place was to wash your feet. And that was unclean. Your feet were unclean because they were tracking God knows what in from the outside to go into the tent. So in that sense, it is important to understand that one of the deals that we are working with here is we are working with the idea that sometimes the ancient pictographic Hebrew just doesn't seem to jive. Okay, now I'm going to recap one other thing for you, and that is that we have this Hebrew word here. Let's see, let's go back to the board. We have this Hebrew word here, okay, pronounced Ra, right? And means evil. And I will remind you that in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, it is the drawing of a man's head. Of course, we know this pictograph well. You see it often with my little smiley face, right? And we have what? We have the twisted rope, And so this is what? This is mind twisted. Understand, evil in the ancient Hebrews' eyes was a twisted mind. Okay, so now here is the part that's important as we're going through this. You can see how things could really, really, really get distorted. Let me explain to you what I mean by distorted. Our minds operate in such a way as to basically filter information. Information is perceived to be relevant by our minds based upon its necessity to create the most effective environment, effective connection, and most effective version of reproduction. What does that mean? That means at the core of our existence, we want to connect, we want to reproduce, and we want to be safe. And as a result of that, unfortunately, what we have is biases. And those biases end up filtering things out inappropriately. Well, in this case, you could probably drive by, for those of you who are devout Christians, or for those of you who are just now coming into your Hebrew roots and haven't yet developed the maturity of understanding of what is really going on in this universe, you have bought into ancient Catholic beliefs. And so when you drive by a house and we have these blow-up dolls of these skeletons and ghosts and all that, in your mind, that's evil. But the truth is in ancient Hebrew's mind, thought a very different way. When we look at these pottery shards, we don't find drawings of ghosts or drawings of demons. We find a head and a twisted rope. Okay? Head twisted, which is what? Distortions, right? What I mean by distortions is that we have altered the reality of what information was actually coming in. Okay? Now, there's a few reasons why this is important, because one of the biggest elements of your life is your limiting beliefs. The level at which your beliefs limit you from doing and performing the actions that A, you were created to do, B, that you have become very much able to do and could really excel at, or even more so, somehow having one of those three things that I mentioned earlier have some sort of effect on you. What do I mean by that? That you don't feel safe, that you're unable to find a way to reproduce, or that you are unable to connect. And those limiting beliefs are preventing one of those three things, and therefore you are suffering severely concerning your potential as a human being. The effectiveness of a human being is big. The effectiveness of a human being is big. Now, there's a few things that are important when we're dealing with the ancient pictographic Hebrew. The ancient pictographic Hebrew is based upon a nomadic lifestyle. A nomadic lifestyle is very, very, very different from a lifestyle of an American. It is very, very different from the lifestyle of any advanced civilization at this time. It is very different from the lifestyle of the Western Roman Empire, who was influenced by social democratic hedonism of the Greeks. Whereas the Eastern Roman Empire was influenced by the Orient and by the mystics and by the people who were more spiritual than they were logical. There is a nun by the name of Karen Armstrong. She is a very, very, very effective writer. She actually wrote a book. I can't remember the name of it at this time, but it basically kind of was an expository examination of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. She is a Jew. She became a nun to try to learn and understand the Christian faith because of her upbringing and her biases concerning the Holocaust. And of course, along the way, encountered Islam and has written multiple books on Islam and received awards from the Islamic community on her education, understanding, etc. Of course, she speaks multiple ancient languages, etc., etc. But one of the things that she touches on in one of her books is the idea that we, as a believing people in Christianity, she's speaking, are stuck in the realm of logos. In fact, she finds that all three Abrahamic religions are stuck in the realm of logos. The idea that logic prevails over mythos. Mythos being what? The ancient understanding of something that's unexplainable, and you just have to allow it to be the unknown. An Eastern mystic understood that there were things that he didn't understand about the universe that were deeply spiritual. The Western Roman would look at those things and say, illogical. That just kind of means that it doesn't exist. If it's not in front of me, it doesn't exist. The reason why this is important is because ancient nomadic Hebrews had both. They were very practical in their operation. They were all very elite warriors, okay? Every one of them was trained in war. Every one of them was trained to fight from the day that they were age 20. Couple things that are important about that, but the first and foremost one is that means that there was a very different thought process when it came to raising your children. Furthermore, they were self-reliant, and they were definitely not somebody who was just going to automatically conform to the status quo or seek assistance from those unless it was absolutely necessary. Why is this so important? Because we are about to encounter the first nomad of the Hebrews, okay? And what I mean by that is that basically there are a few different reasons why Abraham was called a Hebrew, but he was called a Hebrew in this parasha, and that is going to be very important here. Because when we think about the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we need to think Abraham, not the Israelites coming out of Egypt. That was an advanced people compared to this simple people that Abraham was a part of. Now, there's a big reason here that this is important, is because when we encounter Abraham, we try to superimpose our Western social democratic hedonistic philosophies upon him. He didn't think like you, okay? He didn't think like you. And not only that, but when we look at the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we need to ask some serious questions. There's no exception to that in this week's parasha. But I want to go back to our recap now that I've made my point and look again at this word light, just so that we can reestablish the foundation and now begin to build on that foundation, okay? So going back to our board and getting back to page 1, we have light. And in this whole entire situation, we know what? That the ancient pictographic Hebrew, the roots, the child roots and the adopted roots that came off of the drawing of the ox head and the drawing of a man's head were something to do with organization or order, okay? That's important. However, in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, this is the symbol of strength, okay? And this is the symbol of man, or if we go off of the thought process of this page, right? This is a head or mind, and this is twisted, right? Which means there's something wrong with this head. So if we go back over here, then we understand that even though sometimes this is represented as man, it's also represented as head. And what we have concluded and begun to understand is that the word for light in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, not your English Bible, was a strong mind. Now, what we concluded from that, and what I'm going to go ahead and do here is we're just going to kind of move this over a little bit and shrink it down so that we can establish an absolute truth here that in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we have a strong mind for the word light. Okay. And so in the English, it is light. In the ancient pictographic Hebrew, nomadic lifestyle, Abraham's kind of thinking, the word for light had to do with a strong mind. So as we have established these truths, and as we have worked through this process, it is important that you understand that that's never going to go away. That doesn't change. We will build on that wisdom, but we now have been challenged. Our thinking, our filtering has been challenged. Why? Because when our Messiah, and let me just explain for a minute what a Messiah is before you get too caught up in that word, because we have a tendency in American Christianity, we'll just listen to the name. The label itself has Christian in it. And here's the irony. Christian is from the Greek word krios, which means to pour oil upon. It is the equivalent of the Hebrew word mashach. Mashach, which means what? To pour oil upon in order to designate office. In order to designate office. If you are the Lord's anointed, you have been designated to the office of a prophet, a king, or a priest. That's the only time anointing occurred. And the reason why this is important is because when I say you're Messiah, you instantly think Jesus Christ and the cross. But what you don't understand is what a Messiah is supposed to do. Okay? A true priest, prophet, or prince, okay, according to Ezekiel chapter 44, will teach Torah. A true priest, prophet, or prince will bring Torah to a greater understanding. Teach the difference between clean and unclean, holy and unholy. Have you heard that from your pulpit lately? I question probably not. My next thing would I say is that he would teach the feast days. He would teach the name of God, Yahweh, not capital Lord, or Adonai, or Hashem, Yahweh. And if you need help understanding the pronunciation and why it's Yahweh, go Google it and see if you can find your way back to why I use the word Yahweh. In addition to that, he would bring justice to the widows and orphans. He would take care of the fatherless and the husbandless, right? Okay. That's what a Messiah does. So what is Yeshua shows up on the scene, and what does he do? He comes in and he executes justice. He starts telling the bullies to back off. He starts telling the philosophers to stop thinking the way they're thinking, and he starts healing the people, taking away their calamity, taking away their suffering, taking away, regardless of how wicked or how righteous they would appear to be in the sight of man, taking away their pain. And then after that begins to expand upon this amazing teaching about the kingdom of heaven, and has the nerve then, after all these different parables about the kingdom of heaven, half of each gospel contains some sort of parable set about the kingdom of heaven. The rest of the half contains the narrative about what he was actually doing. And so when we go into this understanding, he teaches that the kingdom of heaven is present within us. And then we have to go back and take all of the parables about the kingdom of heaven, begin to apply them to the inner us. Okay? So in that process, the Messiah comes along, And nobody knows he's the Messiah, right? He showed up on the scene. Nobody knows he's the Messiah. How do we know that? Because in the Sermon on the Mount, which I'm specifically speaking of, when he finishes, the people walk away and say, oh, this is one who teaches with authority, not like our teachers, right? They don't know who he is. In fact, it's not until John chapter 10 where they start saying, this might be the Christ, right? And of course, the teachers of the law argue with the people and say, come on, you guys are ignorant. You're untaught. And you don't even know where the Messiah is supposed to come from. He's supposed to come from Bethlehem. This guy comes from Nazareth, right? Okay, whatever. So at any rate, the point being is a Messiah is a people mover. He changes the status of a people from what? From sick to healed, from ignorant to educated, and from unprotected to protected, right? Provision, protection, and instruction in a sense. All right, so as we process this, and we need to understand, as he comes along and he tells these unbelieving Jews, he wasn't talking to Gentiles. He did not say these words to the Western social democratic hedonistic nation of America. He said it to ancient Eastern mystics. You are the light of the world. Don't hide it under a bushel, right? Who lights a candle and hides it under a bushel? So he uses the word or. Why? He wasn't speaking Greek to the Jews. In fact, Paul didn't even speak Greek to the Jews. Paul gets arrested. He gets pulled in to the area of the temple where the stairs are and speaks to one of the Roman soldiers in Greek. The Roman soldier says, hey, dude, you're speaking Greek. Are you that one guy? Right? They can't believe that a Jew is speaking Greek, but all of a sudden, somehow the entire New Testament is written in Greek. Okay, anyways, whatever. I'll get off my soapbox. So getting back to the thought process here, Yeshua is speaking to them in Hebrew, and he goes, you are or. You are ha'or ha'olam. You are or ha'olam, the light of the world. Right? Okay, and so from that point of view, he was not speaking to a people who were ignorant of the word or. How do we know? Because we know when the Jews wrote the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, we'll call it for the sake of new people, but called correctly the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings. When they translated the Tanakh into Greek from Hebrew, they left out the wisdom of Torah. They left out the soul of Torah. They left everything out except the logos. They gave a logos version of Torah to the world. And so he didn't go in there saying, you are phos, you are a light bulb, you are some sort of heat emitting light. And he didn't say that it was order. He was saying that you are a strong mind. Now, he says right in his discussion with the disciples, I can speak directly to them and tell them exactly what they are, but they won't understand because they have dull ears. They are hard of hearing, and they are dull of sight, and they have a hardened heart, just like Isaiah spoke of them in Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah gets his calling. Why is this so important? Well, first of all, you need to understand that if he was saying that to them, he was saying, you are the order that this world needs. He's telling the Jews, you are the order, you are the change that this world needs. But secretly, he's telling the mystics, you are a strong mind. Okay, so as a result of that, there's our foundation. So as we're moving into this week's parasha, a couple things that we need to kind of get our minds wrapped around. The first of which is that we don't understand everything that we need to understand about Abraham from the information that we get from the Torah portion. This is our first encounter of Abraham, aside from Genesis chapter 5, last week's parasha, that talks about how he was born and etc. What do we have as our foundation for this week's parasha? Pretty much nothing. Let me show you what I mean. We jump straight into this thought process. Boom. Now, Yahweh said to Abraham, go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to a land which I will show you. Okay, that's the English. That's the New Living Translation, which I prefer to use as a very readable version and does a pretty good job of interpreting idioms for us. However, it is very important to understand that this is not what the Hebrew says. But here's the problem. A majority of the people believe that Abraham, at the time when he is called to go to the promised land, is Ur of the Chaldeans. This is all that's left of Ur of the Chaldeans, by the way, this ziggurat. But Ur of the Chaldeans was a very intriguing place. It was a part of the huge gathering, as it were, of people that had come together in Shinar, okay? And the city of Ur is pretty contemporary with Bavel and is pretty contemporary with the cities that Nimrod built. Now, there's a few reasons why this is important, but the biggest of which is that Abraham did not leave Ur of the Chaldeans and go to what we would now call the land of Israel or the land of Canaan. He left Ur of the Chaldeans when he was a young child. And after he left Ur of the Chaldeans, Terah, his father, settled in the land of Haran, which is Aramaic Empire or Aramaic territory. Okay. In fact, there's a few places where it talks about how our forefathers were Arameans. Okay. But when we encounter Abraham for the first time in an actual character-based narrative, it's here in Lecha. It's here in Genesis chapter 12. Now, the reason why this is important is because basically a lot of people think that he came straight out of Ur of the Chaldeans into Canaan. He didn't. In fact, he had an entire run-in with Nimrod. And he had a time where he became an idol smasher. And he had a time where he was banished from Mesopotamia. He was banished from the Sumerian Empire. He was banished from that area, I should say. I don't know if it would be the Sumerian Empire per se. We could probably make the connections we need to archaeologically, but I'm not here to do that. So in that principle, then, as we encounter Abraham, there are a few very relevant things present in this parasha that would be a great connection to our foundation that we just built. Why? Well, you need to understand that Abraham had already lived his life. He had lived a long life before he was called to go to the land of Canaan. He already was established as a very effective military leader. He was already established as a servant and worshiper of Yahweh to the extent that all of the people around him were affected, to the extent that he brought, and this is what it says in the Hebrew, 70 souls with him to Canaan. So a lot of people have the unfortunate, distorted, filtered version of this story in thinking that Abraham was called here, that this was Abraham's first experience as a man connecting with Yahweh when that is not true. He has been connected with Yahweh his entire life. He is devout, and everyone around him has been influenced by his religion, to the extent that when when Isaac is to have a bride, Abraham sends his servant to his family in Haran, saying, don't go to the heathen here in Canaan, right? But go to my family. What, they were somehow more godly? Yes. And so it's important to understand that even when Jacob shows up on the scene and comes and kicks it with Laban, Laban was a worshiper of Yahweh. Now, we know from Rachel stealing his teraphim that he also had household gods or good luck charms. Okay, so when we're discussing Abraham, you need to understand that by the time this has happened, he already has a history of being evangelical, if you will, and also has a history of what? His family serving and working with Yahweh. It is a unfortunate, a very, very unfortunate thing that people have taken Abraham, put him in Ur of the Chaldeans, and then in chapter 12, verse 1, he leaves Ur of the Chaldeans, leaves his heathen family, and leaves all of his people behind. No, 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 no. That's not what's happening here. Abraham has lived a life of connection with El Shaddai. Abraham has experienced God already. He continues to maintain a nomadic lifestyle that was foreign to the people of Canaan and foreign to Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur of the Chaldeans was a city-state. A city-state. Okay? What does that mean? That means that the people that lived there were their own nation. Yes, they were connected in with Nimrod and his rulership, but they were a city-state. Okay? And so as a result of that, you need to understand that Abraham begins to practice a nomadic lifestyle early in life. And by the time we encounter him, he is already established in that nomadic lifestyle. Now, the 5 things, I'll go ahead and show them to you so that you can write them down, but we're going to touch on a very important one today, and we're going to get into that a little bit. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull this up really quick while I'm talking to you. But one of the things you need to realize is that a nomad is very, very different from a citizen of a city-state. And there is relevance to that truth. Okay. All right. So when we are looking at this, I want you to be able to take notes, and that's why I'm going to go ahead and pull it up on the screen here. In its simplicity, I think it's important to know that this isn't obviously the end all of defining elements in the ancient Hebrew lifestyle. These are just 5 important points that are really good, and they basically are they are things that you should probably take into consideration as actually stepping into a lifestyle that would be similar to it, because it's actually what your Messiah practiced. Okay. So when we're working with this, obviously, then we need to look at the fact that our culture and the way we were raised, because if you have any element of Western social democratic hedonism in your culture, because I know some people are watching from around the world, you're basically going to find that these things that I'm about to mention in this lifestyle were not they were not things that were quickly quickly accepted or understood in your grandparents' lifetime. They would have had more of a mentality of people from Ur, the Chaldeans, than they would have had of what Abraham was. And remember, Abraham is the father of all who believe, therefore the father of our faith, right? He's the father of all who believe, both circumcised and uncircumcised. In other words, there is no one who is monotheistically connected to Yahweh who Abraham is not the father of. Okay, here we go. So the first one that you need to understand is that nomads are removed from the dominant culture of their time. In short, that means they are not political. It means that they are not connected with the political system that is present as the dominant system in their culture. Now, please understand that what that means is that whatever the dominant culture is of America is actually the true political system, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. Okay? All right. Now, second is going to be nomads needed to be self-reliant. They did not go to an auto mechanic to fix their car. They fixed the car themselves. Okay? They don't go and have a tailor repair their clothes. They repair their clothes themselves. Nomads needed to be self-reliant. Okay? The third one, nomads are nomads were always immigrants and outsiders. Okay? They never were actual citizens of the nations around them, ever. Okay? They stuck to themselves. Doesn't mean they didn't have diplomacy. It doesn't mean that they didn't enter a city for supplies or whatever, etc. It means that they chose not to be people of that land and chose not to worship the gods of that land. Okay? Nomads were pastoral and not urban. Nomads were pastoral and not urban. They were more about animal husbandry and about herbiculture than they were about modern practices of living. Okay? Believe in raising their own animals and their own food instead of going to the grocery store. Okay. Then finally we have, I'm sorry, not finally, but the next one we have is the nomads demonstrated strong, decisive leadership. And we're going to get more into that today, but I want to just give you the last one really quick, which is among nomads, the overriding legal responsibility was hospitality, even for enemies. Okay? Even for enemies. But the one that we are touching upon today is that nomads demonstrated strong, decisive leadership. Nomads demonstrated strong, decisive leadership. That is what we are going to look at today. Okay, so as you can see, your American or civilized nation connection to reality does not fit the reality of a believer in biblical times. You have been taught to believe that being a citizen of your land actually gives you status as a good believer. Unfortunately, the words of Paul override Torah these days. But there's an indication and there is a lifestyle present in Torah that seems to give us an understanding that we are supposed to be nomadic. Now, last year at this time for Lecha, we discussed about what it meant to be nomadic. but we're going to build off of our newfound understanding that we have gained concerning the strong mind. Okay? So in our seeking, we need to start to glean the things from the field. Everything that you are right now is not biblical. That's the change that needs to occur. You say, oh, wait a minute, I'm Torah observant, I've done all this. Do you concern yourself with your citizenship of the land that you dwell in? Do you concern yourself, or do you identify more with the idea of having someone take care of the tasks of maintaining the life that you have? In other words, do you expect everyone else to change? And do you blame everybody else for your problems? Or do you say you are the problem and realize that you are the only one who's going to change? That's the difference between a nomad and a city dweller. A city dweller has already what? Enlisted the assistance of the city to protect them. It's a walled city. It's to protect them. It's to keep them from being hit by marauders, and keeps them from having to have the responsibility of leading their own clan. They like to follow, not lead. Effective human beings do not follow with the intention of being a follower. Effective human beings, if they are a follower, follow for the sake of bringing something to a better status. Okay? In general, when we deal with the ancient nomadic lifestyle, you need to understand that it is a philosophy, yes, but also a mysticism. Now, I know that word terrifies you guys who still practice Christianese. But you need to understand mysticism is a Christianese word for people who do evil things. Mysticism is not a Torah word for people who do evil things. There's a word reserved for that, and that's Gentile. Mysticism is the practice of becoming one with the divine. That's right. A connection between the intensification of all power in the universe and your environment around you. And so when we talk about a strong mind and we see that these crazy people inscribed on their pottery an ox head and a human head, that we could probably conclude that what we think we understand about things, we don't. Okay? All right. So as a result of that, then we need to work on a few things. First of all, in ancient Hebrew nomadic thought, an ancient Hebrew nomadic person did not think themselves to be the toughest person. But they did understand that the intensification of all power in the universe was backing their play. And so they could be superior. And in that way, there was an understanding that in their lifestyle itself, because of that pastoral versus urban lifestyle, they maintained sheep. The reason they maintained sheep over the oxen is because of the amount of care and food and all of those other things. So as they're maintaining sheep, there's a couple things that you probably should know. The first one is that sheep need a shepherd in order to function. Wild sheep oftentimes break into pairs and do not stay with the herd because they are seeking a herd that is led by a leader. Okay. But another important fact that you need to know is that the shepherd then was representative of the livelihood of the family. What does that mean? Well, that's a little bit different from our thought process today, right? We don't think about that the highest industry in our land is sheep. But in their time, it was. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to go out and become shepherds and start raising sheep. What it means is that we need to understand that when we are dealing with symbols, they were culture dependent, okay? For example, I doubt you have a big old bowl of water outside your house so a person could sit down and wash their feet before they come in your home, okay? But the symbol of the container of water offering a solution to being unclean is an example of how the ancient Hebrews thought. So when we say that the shepherd is at the highest level of industry and that the shepherd is the highest form of authority in that industry, then the clan leader by default is represented as a shepherd. To the extent that even Jeremiah addresses the leaders of Israel as shepherds. David thinks of his God, Yahweh, as a shepherd. Okay? Yeshua, the name Yeshua itself, comes from an ancient Hebrew understanding of what a shepherd would do to a predator who attacked his sheep. He would destroy them. The name Yeshua actually has the ancient pictographic meaning of destroyer watches. So when we're dealing with shepherding then, and we're understanding that shepherding is at the highest level of industry, and also in that culture, it was understood as being the highest level of authority, then we understand why the shepherd's crook would be representative of a tribe. You could look at the shepherd's crook and see the lineage written on the staff of who this person descended from. And the intention was that it would be traced back to Abraham so that what? They could have an allotment of land promised to Abraham as long as they were circumcised. Okay, so now here is the part that's important. If the shepherd's crook holds the highest form of authority, then the symbol of the shepherd's crook then in general represents authority. So there are other things in the ancient pictographic Hebrew alphabet that are various words that have philosophical and mystical meanings behind them. But in this case, what we are dealing with is a shepherd's crook and a palm. I will show you what I mean. So when we are dealing with this week's parasha, one of the things that we are going to encounter is, of course, that concept of Lecha. Okay? And that is actually this right here. That is the Hebrew letter Lamed and the Hebrew the final Kaf. Okay, final Kaf. Now it's interesting because really technically how this goes is we do not have to do any searching. We do not have to figure out what the adopted root means. We don't have to figure out what the child root means. Why? It's already a parent root. It is the drawing of a shepherd's crook and the drawing of a hand a palm. Okay. So let's talk a minute about this. In the concept of the ancient Hebrew for the letter Kaf, we have an object. Okay, in this case, I'm going to use my pen for the digital whiteboard. And so what's going to happen is when as humans, when we grab a hold of something, our hand begins to conform, or our hand begins to become the form of the thing that we're taking hold of. So in this case, if I grab this pen and I wrap my hands around it, now my hand has conformed to the shape of this pen. So in principle, in ancient Hebrew understanding, the hand conformed, okay? The hand also covered, right? But generally speaking, the hand grasped and took hold of something, and it conformed to the thing that it was taking a hold of. Well, in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we have some very, very, very interesting things going on. So obviously we have what? The shepherd's crook, authority, right? Okay. And on the other side, we have the palm, meaning to conform, right? To change the composition of, to reflect what it is becoming the form of. And so in general, this means conform to authority. Now, we will make the mistake as Western people of thinking that conforming to authority means submission. But you're not thinking the way that an ancient Hebrew would think. Conforming to authority is becoming the form of that authority. In fact, Yeshua speaks in ancient nomadic understanding when he says, when a servant is perfect, he will be like his master. In other words, as a servant begins to practice the things that his master practices, he eventually becomes the master. Now, when there is a shepherd's crook present, that means that there is a greater and lesser. Let me illustrate for you. Yahweh sees Adam alone in the garden, says, it's not good for man to be alone. I will make a helpmate for him. Ezer kenegdo. We're not going to get into the definition of kenegdo today, but Ezer means to help, assist. This is what I want you to think about. Your friend says, hey, could you come to my house and help me with a task? When you go to the house, I don't care if you are richer, smarter, or you are even somehow in authority to that person. When you go to their house, the first thing you do is say, what do you need from me? What do you need me to do? What does that mean? You are seeking instruction from that person, and therefore you are submitting to that authority. Okay. So in that understanding, then, we understand that if there is an authority present, then there are what? There is a greater and a lesser. And the lesser is there to elevate that authority through honor, through honoring the authority of the person who holds the shepherd's crook. Meaning what? Meaning that you need to take upon yourself the role of the lesser if the person who holds the shepherd's crook is the authority, then you are the servant. You are the subservient one. Now, here's the interesting part. In ancient Hebrew understanding, if you can best me in battle, then I am your servant. Now, there's something very important that needs to be understood there. If you best me in battle and I am your servant, then you are obligated to protect me because obviously I am weaker than you. There is an ancient Hebrew nomadic sentiment that if something is weaker than you, you are to protect it. And so as a result of that, a conforming to authority is somebody who begins to step into the realm of being the protector instead of being the protected. Now, in the effectiveness of human nature, we have a tendency to move in the direction of dependence. Because why? Because we do not want to take absolute responsibility. What does that mean? That it's no one else's business to try to make you okay. It's no one else's business to make sure that you are safe unless you are the lesser. And it's no one else's business to help you reproduce. What does that mean? That means that you take into your own hands the preservation of the species. You take into your own hands the connectivity of social interaction. In that process of your social interaction, you obviously have some influencers who would like to make you think, speak, and act a certain way. But that's not how an ancient Hebrew thinks. That's not how an ancient Hebrew operates. No one is going to tell him how to think. No one is going to tell him how to act, and no one is going to tell them what to say. However, the part that's important is to understand that that's the tendency of the Western social democratic hedonistic mindset to tend towards dependence. Somebody take care of me. The state take care of me. Right? Somebody help me through this. Somebody make this happen, right? Don't get me wrong. There are times when you're the lesser and somebody has a responsibility to take care of you. And that is very, very important, right? It's important to know when you are which. Now, if there is authority present, then that means that there's somebody who needs protected. If there is authority present, then that means that there is somebody who needs instruction. If there is authority present, then that means that there's somebody present who needs provision. Now, I'm going to tell you, we are a nation in general here in America of people who love to give instruction, even when we're not in the position of authority. We have established in our constitutional process and in our thinking that people need advice that we have, regardless of whether they ask for it or not. An ancient Hebrew nomad would not do this, but instead would wait to be asked. Okay? But here's the interesting part. As much as we love to give instruction, we very, very, very rarely love to give provision. And we very, very, very rarely love to give protection. But we will give protection if it fits the sentiment of the social mores. For example, if there is an ideal present that would say that we need to somehow take care of the poor, and it fits the political agenda of the group of people who equate to the majority, then it gets established as a social more, and then they can socially shame you if you don't do it. Okay? And so we teach people to become dependent, and we don't teach them how to become independent. And we're okay with that. But here's the irony. Like I said, we will gladly give instruction on a regular basis. In fact, we have diarrhea of instruction coming out of our mouths. But we will very rarely do the right thing and protect what really truly needs to be protected. And then I'll take it a step further and say it is absolutely off the wall for someone who is a lesser to expect to actually be provided for. It is. And there's an irony there. Because the truth is that hospitality was at the core of Abraham's heart. And instruction was rare. In fact, we only see him give a few instructions to people. We see him do a whole bunch of hospitality. We see him defer on a regular basis to hospitality. But then also we see him protect those who could not protect themselves. So when we look at this conforming thing, right, going back over here, you can see that the idea here is that you are supposed to become the authority. Okay? Now, Yeshua, as he is speaking to the people on the Sermon on the Mount, he says, oh, well, yeah, he says, you are the light of the world, right? Salt of the earth, blessed are the peacemakers, etc., right? Don't worry about what you'll eat, drink, what you'll wear. All those things he's saying to unbelievers. He's saying to the world. That's the key here. They did not believe he was Messiah. And therefore, this instruction pertains to everyone on the face of the earth. Yes, he was speaking to Jews at that time, but it's why? Because he was to the Jew first and then the Greek. But what's really, really important here is when they walk away, they say he speaks as one with authority. He had the shepherd's crook, which means what? His hand had already conformed to the shepherd's crook. His hand had already conformed to the shepherd's crook. Okay, so now the reason why that part is important is because of what is actually said here in the Hebrew. First of all, what we need to do is go into the Hebrew and take a look at it. And in this case, what we're going to be looking at is this right here. Lech, Lecha. That is the name of this week's parasha. Okay. And that says in the English, go from your country. But do you know what it actually says in the Hebrew? Go for yourself? No. Walk for yourself. Okay, so let's talk a minute about this. First of all, in the English, we lose the entire message that Yahweh gave Abraham, because we're trying to put him in Ur of the Chaldeans as an uncircumcised Philistine, all of a sudden getting saved by Yahweh and having this Paul experience on the road to Damascus and then showing up in Canaan. When we lose a good 75 years of Abraham's life to Ur of the Chaldeans, right? So in principle then, maybe not 75 years, but we lose a chunk of his life in Ur of the Chaldeans because we don't look at him as in Haran already being an evangelist, already being established as a authority, already gaining souls. Nefashim is what it is in the Hebrew, not people. Okay. And in that process, then we need to understand that there's something very important being said here, and it's not present in the English. Go for yourself? No, it doesn't say go. That's the Hebrew word bow. It says walk for yourself. Now, let me take you on a little journey. Let's follow this rabbit trail a little bit here. Okay. Give me a moment to get my palette holder here. All right. So we have Lecha. We're going to jump into, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and close the Westminster Leningrad Codex. We'll just jump into this verse. We'll go into the interlinear and specifically the forward inline. And what it says in the English is, now said Yahweh to Abraham, go forth, right? No. In the Hebrew, it says Lech, right? Lech Lecha. And that is what? To walk. Okay. From the Hebrew word halak, to walk. From the Hebrew word yalak, to walk. Okay. Now, when we get into this, the first thing that you need to know, okay, let's do it this way. Let's go get this number and take a look at what it actually says in the lexicon. So I'm going to go and I'm just going to copy the Strong's Hebrew number. We're going to jump into the lexicon. We need to get out of the Genesis Zin and Quantum Physics book where I read you the nomadic Hebrew lifestyle things. And we'll jump back into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible. And in that, now we have to travel, right? To travel. And it's coming from the root word. Now look at this. In our parent root right here, right? Our parent root is the concrete is going to be the idea of king. And the abstract is the idea of kingdom. And the action is the walk. The pictograph lamed is a picture of the shepherd's staff. The kaf is a picture of the palm. Combine these means staff in the palm. A nomad traveled on foot with a staff in his hand to provide support in walking, as well as a weapon to defend against predators or thieves. So before we get into this concept of king and kingdom, we need to understand how they thought about this. Okay. And so as a result of that, then what we need to do is to understand the purple here, right? A nomad traveled on foot with a staff. Okay. Getting back to our concept of a staff, we're holding the staff in our hand, we're walking, but what kind of staff? A shepherd's crook. Why? Because there's plenty of ways that they could have drawn this, but they chose to put a shepherd's crook there because who's walking? The leader is walking and the others are following. Now, remember earlier I said that you should not follow with the intention to always be a follower. You should follow with the intention of becoming the master. You should follow with the intention of becoming the leader. Okay? And I told you in Western social democratic hedonistic lifestyle society like what we live in, the tendency is towards dependence, not independence. But an effective human being will tend from dependence to independence. And it won't stay there, but we'll get to this. Okay. So the next process is going to be the idea that they could have drawn this a different way, but they didn't. They drew a shepherd's crook and called that walking. So when you walk with authority. That's the Hebrew word for walk, halak. But in Jewish understanding, halakha is how to interpret Torah and practically apply it to your life. And so then we start to get into lifestyle. And then what we need to understand is that all lifestyle is a habitual practice of culture. All culture is a set of beliefs and actions that reflect a specific people. Meaning what? As an ancient Hebrew, Abraham practiced a culture. That culture contained beliefs. Were they limiting beliefs? I highly doubt it, because he took 318 men up against a 5-kingdom alliance. Okay? Which you can read in this week's parasha. But what's important here is that Yahweh tells him, go for yourself. Now, Abraham took his wife with him, took Lot with him, and took 70 other souls who he had gained. That's what it says in the Hebrew. It doesn't say he took 70 servants who he had obtained. It was souls he had gained. Souls for the kingdom of heaven, people. Abraham saw my day and rejoiced. That's what Yeshua said. Abraham was a New Testament believer. Which means what? He understood. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Abraham's righteousness was not equated to him as a result of his merit. It was a result of him understanding that Yeshua had done what he could not do. Okay. Now, moving forward now into that understanding, we need to get a deeper understanding of this idea of halak. And we're going to get that from the word king. Okay? So going back into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, one of the things that we are going to encounter is this concept or this idea of king. All right? And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to move over to the Hebrew word melech. Melech. Okay? Now, jumping over into our screen, we're going to jump to another page, and I'm just going to go ahead and put the lamed up as an established understanding, lamed kaf, but we're just going to keep it as the kaf like this, right? And what we're going to do is we're just going to add the mem to the front of it. Now, recall that this is the actual, parent root, okay? In principle, then, we need to understand that that parent root will always stand as the parent root, and that anything that comes into existence with it, we have to basically modify that word, okay? And so in principle, then, we need to figure out what the mem represents in this sense, okay? So as a result of that, we need to talk about something real quick. You guys have seen, and in fact, just because of the fact that I know there's a lot of new people, I'm going to go ahead and draw it. But you guys have seen my illustration of water and an explanation of it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw it real quick here. We'll just jump over to another page here, and I will show you what we have. We have water, right? The sea with all of its waves, right? And then we have this idea of ground, and then we have this dude, right? He is kicking it here on the beach, looking out over the waves, throwing his hands up in the air. Why? Because it's an awe to him for two reasons. Number one, because the sun goes down and drops behind it. It seems as though the sea is consuming or extinguishing the sun, right? And in that process, then there was an element of awe, right? But the principle is that this is how Hebrews understood this, is that this place was chaos. And I know that that's the name of a Greek god, but there's really no other way to describe that state of unrest of all elements at once, right? Chaos. And also it had something to do with might, had to do with the mighty, right? It had to do with the idea that the sea was stronger than the ancient Hebrew, right? So he would look at the sea and go, man, that's mighty. That's bigger than me. I am the lesser when it comes to the sea, right? Okay. So in that sense, then we can kind of illustrate here this idea. We've got the shepherd's crook. We've got the palm that conforms. And all of a sudden we have water, right? We have water representing mighty. And so remember, okay, so let me talk about this real quick. In ancient understanding, the person who sat at the right hand of the person who was in a position of authority was sitting in the position of honor, okay? They were being honored in some way. Either they were the firstborn or potentially the wife or potentially a guest. Okay, when guests would come, they were sat in the seat of honor. In fact, Proverbs talks about that you are not supposed to immediately go to the seat of honor, but you are to restrain yourself until you are invited, lest you be shamed and asked to move because someone else is supposed to be sitting in that seat. Don't assume honor. Wait until you are honored. Well, in ancient Hebrew understanding, then the writing of letters gave honor or precedence to the letter that was rightmost. Meaning what? The rightmost letter honors or modifies or elevates the letter in the wording. Now, where that exception comes is when we start to get into adopted roots. There's a little bit of a difference there. Sometimes the modifying letter can fall at the end, et cetera, et cetera. But usually in child roots, we encounter this letter modifying somehow, usually to the right. Now, there's some exceptions when we get into weak verbs, but I'm not going to get into that. Okay, so that being the case, we have the mem in the position of honor, which means what? It's modifying the parent root. Well, we know the parent root is authority, right? Which means walk. And so then what we have is mighty walk. Mighty walk or mighty walker, or what? Mighty shepherd, or what? Highest shepherd. Well, guess what Melech means in the Hebrew? King. And Malkut means kingdom, which is what? The place where the king walks. So the mighty walker's place of walking is the kingdom. So now when we start to get into the kingdom of heaven is within you, oh boy, Yeshua used words that could really stress a guy out if he continued to walk in his Western social democratic mindset. Now, what does all this mean? Well, if we're getting to the idea that if there's a presence of authority, and that presence of authority means that there is somebody who needs provision. That presence of authority means there's somebody who needs protection. And that presence of authority means there's somebody who needs instruction. Then that means that if we were to take this parasha name and put it all together, along with Yeshua's parables about the kingdom of heaven, and then him having the nerve to say that it's within us, we need to understand that the presence of authority within us or for us means that something needs provision, protection, and instruction. A long time, I've known that Lech Lecha means go for yourself or walk for yourself. Now, we could jump to Paul's idea, right? That work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Fine. We do have that idea that that Ezekiel says, oh, the fathers eat the grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge, as if to say that there's some sort of connection between generations. And of course, Ezekiel says, no, a man will die for his own sin. We do have a responsibility to our Creator as an individual to not be somebody who is worthy of death. Okay? But this goes deeper, because what I want you to think about is the idea that true independence means that you are actually your provider, your instructor, and your protector. Now, bear with me, because you may still be a lesser. And believe you me, there are people who are appointed to provide for you, to protect you, and to instruct you. But what you need to understand is this is deep, because we're talking again about the strong mind. We're talking about what it means to actually be the light of the world, to be the strong mind. Literally, what we have here is an idea that there is an authority within, which means there's something that needs to be governed. There's something that needs to be ruled, right? Because they didn't just draw a picture of a staff, they drew the shepherd's crook in order to make the word walk make sense. And specifically, when you add the mem, it is the mighty walker, right? Or the highest authority who is present. And since Yeshua said, Malchut is within you, if Malchut is within you, then that means what? That means that the mighty walker is within you, walking that land within you. And when Yahweh said, go for yourself, he was saying, Abraham, rule yourself. Rule yourself. And so as a result of that, what we have is this idea that there's some sort of self-mastery that has now come into our understanding. Why? Because we've had to open our minds to this strong mind thing, right? We've had to really kind of let go of what we've understood about light. Remember that this ministry's theme for this Torah cycle until next Sukkot is Hashana Ha-Or, the year of the light. We are to seek depth in understanding about the light this year. So we could get into the deep philosophical idea of self-mastery and start to look at self-discipline. Okay, if you get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, then get up at 5:30 because that's showing that you are disciplined. You know, you could definitely stop smoking. That would probably be a good plan. You could stop drinking. That would be an even greater plan, right? Those type of things. But the problem is that there's something deeper present within you that needs that order, and interestingly enough, needs to recognize the position, okay? When we talk about provision, instantly people want to think about food, because we don't understand that there's more than just food involved in provision, because we're kind of consumers, right? We eat, we consume. But in a nation or in a country where that is probably the least available thing, then we start to get into the idea of provision necessarily being shelter, provision being clothing, etc. Okay. So when we think about provisions, I want you to think about what Yeshua said on the Sermon on the Mount. He said, take no thought for what you will eat. Okay, I want you to think about what is Yeshua's definition. I want you to think about how esoteric he was speaking here. Because what we have a tendency to do is want to literalize his Sermon on the Mount, forgetting that he's a Messiah, that he's a people changer, and that he didn't show up there just to be Jewish. He showed up there to show people how to become better Hebrews. Okay? They had developed a pride about their Judaism. They had developed a pride about their philosophies. They had developed a pride about their privilege of the oracles of God. What does Paul say? He says, what advantage has the Jew anyways? Much and in every way, for they have been given the oracles of God. And so when we start to get into a thought process that Yeshua's words were literal throughout the Sermon on the Mount, we miss something important, and that is that he was sent to what? To the lost sheep of Israel. When we encounter a moment when the disciples say, dude, what is that parable about? Why are you speaking in parables of the people? And he said, because some will understand and some will not. And so I will give parables about the kingdom of heaven, et cetera, et cetera. The Sermon on the Mount is no exception. So now he comes along and he says, take no thought for what you will eat. Well, what does it say in Yeshua's temptation when he has the stones and the tempter says, change these stones into bread? He says, man shall not live on bread alone, but every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. So take no thought for what you will be instructed, right? Take no thought for what you will receive from Torah, right? And then brings up Solomon. I'm sorry, the sparrow, right? He brings up the sparrow, and in that says, hey, look, they were provided for, so why wouldn't you? Well, how much of that is a result of your limiting beliefs that you don't actually have the revelation you've been seeking? Of course, James says you don't have because you don't ask, but it also says that a double-minded man will not ask the right questions because he's blown about by every wind of doctrine that comes along. And that's really easy when we start to get into biases. How quickly do we dismiss Middle Eastern beliefs because it's different from Christianity when there's much wisdom to be gleaned from the Orient? So then when we get into this idea of limiting beliefs, when we get into this idea of not having an open mind of understanding, then we understand why then Yahweh would tell Abraham, there's some changes that need to be made here. So in that same sense, he says, take no thought for what you will drink. And of course, Yeshua calls himself the living waters. And of course, at Pesach, we take communion. And when we take communion, it is the New Testament sealed in his blood, or the new covenant, or the Brit Chadashah sealed in his blood, which was a promise that the Torah would be written upon our hearts. Okay, so then in all of that, then we have left what? That what would be arrayed Well, I will remind you that the word bush, beit sheen. In fact, let me just go ahead and illustrate it real quick, just to add to our ancient Hebrew knowledge today. So the word shuv, which is going to be a sheen vav bet, is the concept of return or repentance. Okay, we'll just say return. Let me go ahead and change the color here. I studied some things about how to be a very effective teacher, and one of the things that I learned is about color. All right, here we go. So this is return, right? Return. And then we have the word bush, which is the opposite, right? So this is going to be beit vav sheen. Okay. Well, what's the word bush mean? Word bush is shame. Okay. So what is this in the ancient pictographic Hebrew? Well, basically we have the two front teeth, right? We have the two front teeth, and we have the drawing of a tent. Okay. Two front teeth in a tent means what? Press to the tent. Sheen beit means to press, teeth, right? Pressing down. So this is press to the tent. Or return, right? And then, so we have the guy out hunting, and he returns to the tent because he's been out hunting. He sees the tent afar off, and in his mind, there's a relief there. Those are all words that are connected with this idea of pressing to the tent. But then on the other hand, we have the beit sheen, and it literally means to press away from the tent. So now we have the beit, and then we have the sheen, and that means to press away from the tent. And so in that way, there's something very interesting that happens, and that is the idea that shame has to do with nakedness. In fact, bush can mean nakedness. Okay, that's the idea of shame, right? So bush means nakedness or dryness or being exposed to the elements, not being protected by the tent. So here's something amazing. Watch this. This is just an example of a deeper understanding of clothing. The Hebrew word for putting on clothes or clothing yourself is lavash. This is what I want you to think about. If bush means shame, applying authority to it then becomes the word to clothe one's self. So you can understand now that some of these things that we have got going on have to do with ancient Hebrew understanding in the Sermon on the Mount that you can't even touch in the English or the Greek. And so as a result of that, now you can see provision, protection, and instruction goes a lot deeper. But the idea that there is an authority within you, and that authority, when Yahweh told Abraham, look, dude, you need to leave your family and your country. You need to go to a land that I will show you. There's something very important you need to understand. Yahweh was giving Abraham land. Land, to this day, is hands down the most powerful proof of wealth that you can possibly have. During the time of the chancellery courts, back way when English law was first established to what we have today, and of course you guys know that we have that idea of the bar association basically having the same standard or the same authority as the British courts. Because of course, all we are is rebellious British. And so as a result of that, basically this idea is this: during the chancellery courts, there was a idea of a deed of land being given to someone, and it was an actual action of gifting. The word deed had to do with gifting. And so when the king wanted to honor somebody, he would take a bag of dirt, and there would be a survey done of the land that he was going to gift to somebody, and he would hand that dirt over. That would be the deed of trust. He would hand that dirt over to that vassal, that person whom he trusted and wanted to honor. He gave him land, and he became the lord or the baron of that land. And so he went from being some scrub named John to Lord John, right? Okay. And so in principle, then what we need to understand is this: Yahweh is going to give Abraham land as an honor for Abraham's operation with Yahweh in Haran, not some new salvation. But Abraham needed to make some adjustments to his brain before he arrived. And I'm going to have to assume that two big ones had to do with what was going on with his wife and had to do with what was going on with Lot, because those are the two huge occurrences that occur in the land of Canaan, right? But there's something more. Look what Abraham does when he goes down to Egypt. Look what he does when he encounters Abimelech. Remember Abimelech. This is the crazy one, right? Abimelech, king of the Philistines. The uncircumcised Philistines, remind you. Abimelech takes Sarah into his household, believing that she would become his wife, and has a dream. And Yahweh approaches him and says, "You're a dead man." And Abimelech argues and says, "How am I a dead man? Will you destroy a righteous nation?" Think about the word righteousness. And now, in principle, all of a sudden, God says, "No, that's his wife," right? And so then Abimelech says, "Why did you lie to me?" And he was like, "Well, because I was afraid." So Abraham had some adjustments to his limiting beliefs that needed to occur. And that's why Yahweh said, "Lech, Lecha," not because of somehow there was going to be this new way of operating when he arrived at Canaan. Abraham already knew the lifestyle. And so what I want you to think about is, you as a Torah observant, or you as a Christian who is not Torah observant, if you think that you have arrived at some place where now all of a sudden everything's kosher, you need to understand that there is an always upward, always outward information gaining, changing world life, everything thought process occurring with you your entire life. But the idea of taking authority or having self-mastery does not equate to some kind of like guru on the mountain or motivational speaker style process, as much as it does contain some semblance of somebody who is becoming one with the intensification of all power in the universe and the connection to his environment, becoming an influencer. Remember, I said that an effective human will go from dependence to independence. And so in self-mastery, eventually you go from being dependent on people and the state and all of the things to what? Becoming yourself independent, being able to what? To show yourself to be somebody who is effective without the assistance of others. But it doesn't stop there. Because the next thing that happens is as we begin to become effective, as we begin to become more spiritually inclined towards the energy, towards the authority that's outward. Remember, we're talking about the authority that's inward. We're talking about Melchut HaShamayim, the kingdom of heaven, being here, not out there, here. Okay. And there being a king here, and that king apparently seems to be you. Therefore, you're ruling the kingdom of heaven. Oh boy, were we stepping on some toes now. Okay. So in that premise, then there's an understanding that that's because we're moving from dependence into independence, but that's because eventually we're going to move into interdependence. You can be as self-mastered as all you want. I had some really difficult things occur in my life at one point. And I realized that my philosophy was flawed. You see, short version is that there's a point in time where I realized I didn't like who I was. Nobody else did either, but that's irrelevant. I finally came to a conclusion that I did not like me. I didn't know I didn't like me. And for the longest time, I didn't like me. And that played a role. Because one of the things you definitely need to learn how to do is love yourself, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. You love yourself first. You master yourself first. You feed yourself first. You provide for yourself first. You instruct yourself first. But not so that you can go sit in isolation and be cool with God. That ain't happening. Every single last person in scripture, as they began to move from dependence into independence, was being prepared to lead a nation, being prepared to lead a people, being prepared to become a shepherd. They had their time in the wilderness. They had their time in nature. They had that guru on the mountain moment. So I came up with this parable about this guy who basically realized that he didn't like himself. And so he began to try to find a way to change. As he began to change, he became excited and he wanted to share it with others, but nobody really wanted to know how to change. And so what he decided to do is just go be a changed person, some guru on the mountain. And of course, some people along the way might come and ask him for assistance and advice or whatever. And basically over time, he just became lonely and realized, what's the point of being changed if I'm the only one who's going to change? And what's the point of being changed if in that process, now no one else very rarely seeks my wisdom? I am elite to everyone else in my thinking. I'm going to leave this mountain. I'm going to go back to living the way I lived because there's no sense in changing. And so he goes back to living the way he lives, but he can't, right? Because it can't, but it affects his conscience now. He can't do what he used to do. He can't be who he used to be. Now, granted, this is not me, but this is my parable. And so then basically, eventually he realizes that all he can do is just try to make every situation better than he found it. And understand that everybody around him is expecting the world to change, and everybody around him is blaming everybody else. No one is saying they're the problem. So he, on a regular basis, is going to make sure that he says he's the problem, and he's going to be the change. That is the principle here. Self-mastery is not intended for you to just be independent and go off by yourself and do your own thing. If you have become a master of self, be prepared. You are going to lead a nation. Now, that nation may be your own family of 5, but you are going to lead a nation. And those people in that nation will be great because you have become great. You don't become great just so you can be great. You become great to teach other people how to become great. But here's the kicker. It will not be as a result of you becoming great. It'll be a result of you admitting that you needed to change in the first place, because somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to admit that they need to change. The problem is that everybody else thinks that they are good. They think that they've got it figured out. They think that, okay, well, I'm doing the best I can, and therefore I don't need to hear instruction, or I don't need to hear rebuke. But the truth is you've needed more rebuke than you ever have in the entire time that you have been in your life than when you stepped into the kingdom of heaven. When you stepped into the kingdom of heaven, you need big time rebuke. Why? Because Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. What does that mean? Something's wrong with your head. Something's wrong with your head. Well, that twisted rope, that twisted mind is evil. Okay? That's what evil is you choosing to stay in your wounds, you choosing to stay in your shame, you choosing to stay in your fears and your anxiety and your limiting beliefs, and you are just as bad as the people who you think should change. The truth is, you might even be worse because you know the path and you still don't walk it. And so as a result of that, I think it is very important as you hear this message that you come to grips with the idea that you're not all that, but you are all of that. Remember the table. Wait until you're put in the position of honor. But I'm going to tell you, Proverbs says, do you see a man who is good with his hands? He will not stand against he will not stand before mere men, but he will stand amongst kings. You will not be recognized until you step into that self-mastery. When the little tiny things stop affecting you, and all of a sudden, it's no longer about your fears and paranoia and your wounds. How many of you say, oh, you know what? My father was an alcoholic. That's why I'm such an asshole. Well, guess what? You haven't changed. And guess what? You are not the change that this world needs. How do I know? Because you're blaming somebody else. You say, oh, well, you know what? I have this poverty, or I am disadvantaged because of the color of my skin, or because of the way America treats my people, or because of some other thing. You know what? You're not the change that this world needs. You're not. When you finally grasp the idea that there is something inside of you so powerful that it could create a spiritual evolution on this earth, then you understand that you're the change that this world needs. And I'll bet you were put in a position of honor. I'll bet you. Because when I began this journey as a piece of crap, as just a horrible human being, selfish, and completely, my philosophy, I had 3 philosophies. The first one was F the world, right? That there's nobody worthy of any happiness, nobody worthy of anything. I was miserable. And in my thought process, nobody else deserved to be happy. Second was, if you had something that I wanted, I was going to take it, because I'm not going to wait to have somebody decide to give it to me, because in my mind, I didn't even think about earning it, but I'm not going to wait for somebody to give it to me. I'm going to take it. And the reason I'm going to take it is because you probably aren't a very good person to have it anyways. You probably think that people don't deserve to be in your backyard. You probably think that people don't deserve to be helped, et cetera, et cetera. So in my mind, I'm taking it, and I will give it to somebody who needs help. I used to just take stuff to give it to somebody else. And my third philosophy above anything else is this world's never going to change, so we may as well just burn it to the ground. So you weren't allowed to be happy around me. I would make sure you were miserable. I would take your stuff. In addition to all that, my thought process in my mind is as soon as you're dead, the better. Well, eventually I didn't like that person anymore. And I decided that I would figure out how to get rid of the things that were making me think that way. And as I began to realize that those things were making me think, the things that were making me think that way were actually self-loathing, trauma that I refused to heal from, and entitlement. When I got rid of those things, when I healed from those things, and when I accepted my position, all of a sudden, people wanted to know what had happened. And so I began mentoring people. It wasn't long after I began mentoring people and realized that I had stepped out away from everybody else who was still screwed up, that I started to begin to teach what I'm teaching today. And who'd have thought that someday I would be on YouTube with the philosophies that I had, that I would be someday on YouTube teaching people to become the change that this world needs by doing two simple things: admitting you're the problem and no one else is, and admitting that you're the only one that's going to change and changing. That's the key here. And so as we look at Lech Lecha, the way that it should be understood in the Hebrew, as we understand that Yahweh was saying that Abraham had some things that he needed to change before he went to the promised land. And not only that, but that he was still going no matter what. This is one thing you need to know. As much as we have free will and there's an element of indeterminism in our processes, we make choices, those choices are cause and effect. This choice causes this thing to happen, then we make a choice about that, and we cause this thing to happen. There is a predetermined potential within you to become a master, a leader, to make more masters and leaders, and eventually we will have a revolution in thought, a revolution in our spiritual condition, and a revolution in the way that we treat human beings in the name of God, and the way that we justify ourselves when it comes to the things that are enemy with God. Remember, it says the flesh is not subject to the Torah, nor indeed can it be. Romans chapter 8, verse 7. And so as a result of that, it is important to really start to get your mind wrapped around to the idea that this really isn't about you. In fact, you really actually need to learn to not matter, because that's when you will matter. It's not until then. Right now, you don't. You matter in your mind, but you are not effective in this world. You need to learn to take hold of the shepherd's crook and become the shepherd of yourself so that you can become the shepherd of others. You need to take control of the traumas and heal from them. You need to take control of the wounds and heal from them. You need to take control of the entitlement and get it out of your head. Nothing that you have in front of you right now in your world is yours. It was never given to you for you. It was given to you for some effective process of changing this world. I promise you that. No matter how it is. Even if you're some guy watching on YouTube and you're living out of your backpack and you got a cardboard sign on the side of the road, that backpack ain't yours. Or if you're some person who's living up in the higher heights of a city and you have a house so big that you could park a semi-trailer in your walk-in closet, you still have no entitlement to what's in front of you. So in that principle, then, understand you need to get rid of entitlement. You need to stop thinking that you have anything coming, because you don't. And then, of course, obviously, we need to get rid of the bitternesses getting rid of the bitternesses is getting rid of the wounds, getting rid of that sense of entitlement. And then, of course, finally, stop loathing yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. You try to love anybody else without loving yourself, and all you're going to do is create an incongruity and a crap ton of anxiety in the person who's trying to trust you. If you're going to give love to somebody else, you need to love yourself. Now, this is not black and white. This is a dynamic. And what I mean by that is that it takes time and percentages. So right now, maybe you love yourself 10%. Just try to be 15%. It doesn't mean that you have to get everything right. Just try to give yourself a little bit more grace, because you want to give other people grace, and let yourself have grace. But don't feel entitled to grace. And definitely don't think that if you don't heal from your wounds, that you're not going to hurt somebody, because you are, and you probably already have. Your wounds have done damage beyond what you ever know. And you think you've just kept them to yourself, and you think that you've been a good person and you haven't been like the person who hurt you. No, you are the person who hurt you until you heal. For those of you who are on YouTube, I will say Shabbat Shalom.